Save on family favorites at Safeway. This week at Safeway, get 18-count Lucerne cage-free eggs, large grade AA for only $3.47 each with digital coupon limit 1. Plus, get mega packs of bone-in USDA choice beef New York strip steak for $7.97 per pound with digital coupon. Limit 2 packages. Also this week at Safeway, 23 to 29.5 ounce boxes of Kellogg's giant size cereal are buy 2, get 3 free when you buy 5. Member price. Visit Safeway.com or head in store for more details.
Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And we have officially our second guest ever on Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. They said it couldn't be done. Thank goodness they were wrong. I'm so happy to have somebody who I've mentioned on the show a few times and a few people have asked about because I've maybe sort of lightly teased, wouldn't it be so great if this person was on the show? So finally, we were able to make it happen. I'm so happy. With us, we have Kate Brauning, who is also a published author of at least 2 books. I've read 2 of your books. I forget if you had a third or fourth, so hopefully I'm not wrong about that. But she's also the creator of the Breakthrough Writers Bootcamp, and somebody who has helped me with my books over the years and who I have to always credit because I'm like, well, technically, Kate told me this, and I'm just telling all of you what Kate told me. So if you have a problem with it, you can ask Kate about it. How's it going, Kate? That's a little embellishing, but not too much.
Well, thank you so much. It's so great to be here, John. I am really excited to talk to you and get to be your second ever guest on your podcast. So let's do it.
Sounds good to me. And Kate, I hope you've been doing well. It's always great to catch up with you and chat with you about stuff. One of the things, I brought up when I brought up you has been just, you're definitely a resource in terms of really understanding the current market and what kind of stories really seem to be breaking through the noise out there. And so I want to start with like my own kind of question, because we are going to look at a prompt. We are going to look at something that we, are going to react to live like we usually do on the show. But Kate, how would you, I'm kind of curious, how would you kind of describe fantasy right now? Adult fantasy, young adult fantasy? What are some of your observations on what's kind of been hitting at the moment, especially for folks who might be listening who are like, hey, I might have this first or second draft kind of wrapping up and I might be querying soon to a few agents.
Wow. Yeah, that is a big and complicated and incredibly important question. It's for fantasy especially. It's just such a particular market. Young adult is usually trails adult fantasy in what's going on. So if you're a young adult writer, you're a middle grade writer even, and you want to see, what might be coming down the pipeline, check out adult fiction and see what's, striking hot there, because usually the editors and book buyers want to see if it worked in adult, will it work in kidlit? So check out the New York Times, bestsellers list, look and see what the industry, like trade publications, are giving starred reviews to, see what's winning the World Fantasy Award, the Hugo Award, and see if there's anything there you think you could adapt for a kidlit audience. But really specifically, I think for a long time, and in publishing, that's, going to be 5-10 years, right? That's it. That's a generation or more in publishing terms. But especially in the last, 2 to 3 years, the market is trending away from the things we've seen time and time again. I think one of the things that's really so special about fantasy is it capitalizes hard on our ability to imagine and to take us away from where life is right now, or to take us away from it and yet back to it, in social commentary in a way that we can see it a little more clearly. And that is really hard to engage the human imagination on a commercial market scale, tens of thousands of people who might want to buy your book, if it's kind of the same Western settings, tropes, plot devices that we've seen before, spy in the court, or kid who discovers their royalty, or latent powers now, blooming, and you might be the chosen one. It's a lot of those tropes, while they're amazing, standbys of the fantasy genre, it's a lot harder to engage the human imagination on a commercial scale if those things have been done again and again and again. So anything that can really strike that human imagination in a new way, explore new ground, have the capacity for surprise. Other mythologies, hopefully writing within your own lane, but other mythologies, other experiences across the scale, from race to religion to orientation to socioeconomic status to neurodivergence, even to different understandings of what the world can look like, and building outside of our expectations there. I know that's really vague, but anything that gets away from the norm and the standard and brings back in a new way the capacity to surprise and engage our imaginations is what's doing well. Is that clear as mud?
It's super clear, and I brought this up, I think, in the last episode. I said that fantasy, for me, my observation, it tends to track really well with movies. If you just do the same movies every year, people get sick of it. The same Marvel movie, I've already seen this a few times. But what seems to take off is when it maybe has some of the familiarity, some of those tropes, some of the, it's got a little bit of what's familiar and what makes me feel comfortable as somebody who just wants to have a satisfying emotional experience with a book. But also, it's got to have something a little different. Legends and Lattes, the title alone is kind of what got people to read that, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is comfortable and familiar, kind of Westerny, but it's also adding something totally different. So if you're gonna, go into that world, like, you do have to do something really different that's like eye-catching, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a rash of bakery magic fantasy that's doing really well, more cozy style, or even quite darker. People getting poisoned, somebody who bakes, love spells into, their cupcakes, and it's very sort of like sensory rich, food driven, almost contemporary fantasy stories have been a lot of fun. And the market's really enjoying those, just because fantasy that's not fate of the world, it might be fate of someone's world, but not fate of the nation, is relatively unexplored, by comparison. So that's something that's doing really well, just as an example of where the genre can go, and that the market seems to really be enjoying that.
Yeah, I'm noticing a lot with, I'm a millennial, so I'm always kind of watching, what is Gen Z up to now? What are those whippersnappers working on? And I have noticed they like the slice of life stuff. They really they want to chill with their stories. They don't always want the epic adventure action. Sometimes they do, I guess. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying. And, that's a big reason why, because some of my latest novel that I've been working on, I was kind of doing little things with it just this morning, and, wanting to make my main character like a fortune teller, because I was like, you never get to see the fortune teller be the main character in a pirate fantasy. So it's kind of fun to just twist things around a little bit. And, they also love food. I think food in general, when in doubt, putting a little bit of food in the book can really help, I think. Okay, so I guess we can get into this prompt. Are you ready to go?
Let's do it.
Okay, here we go. So as usual, our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, sent me this prompt today. And I will say I did ask Natalia to find something that she thought maybe would be great for Kate. Natalia and Kate don't know each other, but I have told Natalia about you before, so I've told her.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I gave her kind of a list of here are things that this is where Kate, her weakness is. So let's give her a real challenge to. No, I'm just.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Our other producer, Bridget Surdock, she has the day off for this one, because if we need any fact checking or clarifications, hopefully we can police each other on that. But okay, so here we go. All right, we're looking at this for the first time, so we're going to give our off the cuff advice. Let's hope it goes well. This is from username Normal Kush. I'm just going to call you Normal. And they write, what if your idea has already been done before? So this is the question for my story. that they put in the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. Here we go. So Normal writes, I know that almost every idea has already been done before, but what if the other story was iconic because of that idea itself? I know it's a little confusing, but hang with me. Like, if I have to give examples from my actual problem, I want to write two characters who are on opposing sides and both are at the pinnacle of their skills, and naturally it reflects in their personality, the way they talk, think, their morals, everything. And I obviously want them to clash at one point in my story. Now, all that I just described is similar to the story of Jujutsu Kaisen's manga/anime, where one could argue whatever I mentioned above was the best part of it. And to be honest, I am inspired by Jujutsu Kaisen as well. So maybe that's why it even reflects in my story too, but it's not the same story. Its theme is different, the goals are different, setting is somewhat similar, but still different enough to stand on its own, and many more. But just the part I mentioned in the start and the two characters' relation to the main character is somewhat similar to the one in Jujutsu Kaisen, and it really bums me out. Makes me feel like I am writing a cheap knockoff. Public opinion is also a matter of consideration, but it really becomes a problem when I start to doubt my story too. I've tried to make it different, but some parts just can't be changed or they lose the flair to me, and some are really necessary for the story itself. I don't know what to do. Okay, so remember when I talked about Gen Z writers, Kate? And
Yeah.
I'm sure you've noticed this too. Anime, it's the hot new thing to take anime and turn it into other things. And us Westerners just love anime tropes. And so I say that with kindness and love and enthusiasm, even though it's a topic that I think is very contentious. But I have so many reactions to this. Do you want to start?
Sure, I would love to. Well, first, thanks for sharing your issue with us, Normal. I think it's so conscientious of you to want to be the kind of writer that doesn't rip off someone else's work, and also really ambitious of you to want to stick with your idea, but also do something that's just yours with it. And I think what's really cool here is that almost always my first reaction to someone saying, what if my idea's been done before, is to come back with, your idea has not been done before because you haven't done it. And if you really bring yourself to the idea, it's going to be different than somebody else's because you're different from them. And specifically in this case, my thought is really what you're talking about is just a trope or a recognizable dynamic between two characters, two competing or aligned experts, rivals in a sense. We see that in all kinds of genres because it is a way that people in real life relate. So of course we're going to get that happening multiple times in different stories. So it's not at all, certainly not copyright infringement, and it's certainly not you writing a cheap knockoff or taking too liberally from their work for you to also have two rivals or two aligned experts. Like, you could put those same characters into the Olympics or into the Great British Bake Off or into Formula One racing or into a legal procedural and come out with very different plots and shows and premises and even different audiences you appeal to. So I say, look for what is unique about your experts and what makes them their own unique person, make them 3D, make them of longings and wounds and backstories and goals that are different from anything that feels too close to you. Just make them their own people. And then that will inform the dynamic they have in the story enough that you'll have your own plot, your own beats, or your own take on those things. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that there's no way for you to, I've talked before on this show about how ideas are very cheap. The ideas kind of just, they come, it's all about how you execute it. And if anything, I just feel like you need to embrace the comparisons people will make to the things that they know about. That's all part of marketing a book, isn't it? It made me think of, since it's an anime thing, it makes me think of how when Creed 3 came out, Michael B. Jordan directed that movie, and he was embracing the fact that he had based the rivalry between the two main characters on Naruto, one of the most famous anime. And I think he looked at that and it was a clear influence on him. And it was something that he felt like, you know what, I absolutely can embrace these influences and actually use it as a way to get people excited for my story, to be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wouldn't have thought, that you could take this and, but we do it all the time in publishing, like, oh, this book is this meets this, I think the only trouble you run into is when it does start to feel a little bit like you aren't adding your own spin to it. If you're just sort of making, oh, I'm going to make my version of Harry Potter, magic school. It starts to become too similar. It's like, okay, so ostracized boy, parents aren't in the picture, deals with the school bully. And then people, I think, are going to be less forgiving, because then it's feeling a little bit like, okay, yeah, you aren't adding that sort of fresh angle to it. But if anything, that feels very hard to do. I feel like we instinctively don't want to do that a lot of the time. Or if we accidentally do, it's one of those things that if you're doing it accidentally, a lot of people won't even notice, I think. So I think that might be the case for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so smart, because, for example, Alien is what? Jaws in space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that is a perfect example of how you can take a central dynamic, a character relationship, a trope, a defeat the monster type story, and just bring completely new light to it that makes it just really honor the original source. And also, you would never watch Jaws and Alien back to back and think, oh man, one of them ripped the other off. Or even if you think about Die Hard, it's a neo-Western in that it follows the tropes and characters and often plot beats of like your classic John Wayne Westerns. And yet it's completely its own thing and reaches an entirely new audience too.
Yeah, and there's also a way to use stories you really like and use them as the basis to kind of mess around with, your story could be an inverse of a story you really like. So that makes me think of, how Brandon Sanderson, when he wrote Mistborn, he has said many times, yeah, I wanted to write a story that was like, what if in Star Wars, the bad guys won? And so Mistborn is kind of a story that like follows that logically years and years later. And he was able to do that, of course, in a way that, you don't read Mistborn and think like, oh my gosh, here we go. Star Wars A New Hope much? Like George Lucas should sue. Yeah, you don't experience that at all. You're just kind of like, oh, that's kind of a cool twist. That's a good way to like put this movie's framework in my head in a way that, I can understand what the author is trying to do, but still get immersed at the exact same time. I also think though, it's putting so much pressure on yourself to be original.
Yeah.
I think if you're trying so hard to subvert every trope, you're just trying to be original for the sake of being original. Again, yeah, you do need some familiarity. You do need some tropes, because that's what people wrap their heads around, especially younger readers these days. I know there can be some discourse on how much people use tropes in terms of like, oh, I only read books that are enemies to lovers and stuff like that. So on the one hand, it's helpful because people look for these certain tropes and they want everything to be like categorized like a library system. But in another sense, yeah, if you try to just avoid and subvert everything, yeah, you're going to have a harder time. I think people are going to be a little bit like, this story I thought was going to be one thing. You made it seem like one thing. But now as I'm like 100 pages in, now it feels like something else. I'm putting the book down. And that unfortunately happens a lot.
Yeah. Something I think that fits right in here is House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Have you read that one?
I have it on my shelf right over here. I'm not going to go for it because it's on top of the bookshelf and I might knock a bunch of books down. But yes, love T.J. Klune.
It is so beautiful. And I think it's an amazing example of what we're talking about here, where there is kind of a chosen family boarding school foster house dynamic, but it's done so differently. And my dogs are agreeing with me. You could probably hear them there in the background. They loved it too.
They're big fans.
But it's such a different internal take on the almost Umbrella Academy tropes.
Interesting. Okay. I'm following along.
I don't know what else what else you might comp it to, but it's a lot of elements we've seen before. And yet this is collected and set from the perspective of a man who has a very rote kind of lifeless existence as an inspector of these children's homes. And it becomes his love story in a just really slow burn, intense, delicious, kind of genteel and yet very high stakes way. If you're looking for an example of how to take things that have been done before and give them entirely new heart and new life and new sense of character, that's an excellent one.
I agree completely. And I think, well, first of all, I think it's very funny. It just dawned on me that the last time we had a guest on, the first time, not only did we also talk about In the House of the Cerulean Sea, but we literally used the opening paragraph as an example of a great opening to a book. And we kind of dug into that a little bit. And so for folks who didn't catch that episode, that was the interview, or the, not really an interview, but Craig Hanks episode. Yeah. So check that out as well. I love the opening of that book. But I think Natalia, our producer, had an ulterior motive here, because it also dawned on me that I did promise to respond to a listener comment that came in the YouTube channel very, very recently. And I think it was also along these lines. So I actually want to, I dug it up here real quick. This is from Drummer Guy 438, who has been commenting on the show. And I did respond and say, like, I'd read their comment and I had said, oh yeah, I would love to like bring this up on the show. And this could be a great opportunity, because I think they are kind of asking something that's along the same lines. So here's what they wrote. They put, I've got a question, maybe a discussion topic. How do you write and avoid pulling in elements from other media you've watched or read? I've been paralyzed in my writing for a long while. I'll be working on a scene and I'll have a moment where I suddenly see something that reminds me of some other media. As soon as that happens, the scene is dead, and a voice in my head tells me I'm a plagiarizing fraud. I want to write the story that's in my head, but that inner critic is very loud lately, and I'm finding it difficult to push through. There are so many things to this, Kate. And first, I gotta say for this person, I do love that they're looking at their book as scenes. That always, as soon as I see that, I'm like, oh, thank you. I love that you're thinking of your book as scenes, because that helps so much to like really contextualize where to begin with this stuff. Because yeah, if you can write a really good scene, you can write a really good book. I forget who said that, but they were correct when they said it. Did you say that, Kate? You might have said it.
I have no idea. I don't think I said it.
You're like, I say all kinds of things.
It sounds like someone smarter than me probably said it.
I also want to say, please don't be so hard on yourself. You're not a plagiarizing fraud, especially as Kate, you already brought up that this person is also being very conscientious of like, I want to make sure that I'm not doing anybody wrong, when this other media is coming in. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's so indicative of what it takes to be a writer. It takes a lot of insight and self-awareness and compassion and love for books. And I see that coming through here so much with this writer, because they don't want to rip something off. They don't want to put something out there that's been done before. And I think my reaction to that is, again, just bring yourself. Anytime there's something that reminds you of media you've seen before, what would you do differently? Like, work on cultivating and using the artistic vision that you clearly already have. Like, lean into that. For example, I'm a big Walking Dead fan, but the early seasons are my favorite ones. And when I actually love to write zombie fiction, it's something that the market doesn't always love for books, but I love. And what I do there is think about what I would change and what I would do differently and what I think they get wrong, or what I think they do so right that I want to do my way or a little more of. I want to add queer kids. I want to put it in the mountains. I want to put it in the winter. I want to make it not about a cure, but a new normal. I want to make it not about humans being the monster, but maybe our own demons from the past being the monster. And this is a fresh start. There's so many things you can do there when you really bring your artistic vision to the table. So I would say trust yourself more as a writer.
Yeah, definitely trust yourself. And yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Walking Dead thing, because like, only because you mentioned it, I'm like, yeah, when I think of your book, The Ballad of Dina Caldwell, I remember that's such an Americana sort of like, the world is like, it's a bit in the future, but it is kind of different. And there's like these, it hinges on this like big traumatic thing that happens to your main character. Mm-hmm. It feels more Walking Dead than I think I really noticed. But I can't imagine if you had been writing that book, and you had written one of those really great early scenes, for example, and had been like, oh, my scene is dead because this is too much like Walking Dead. Well, I certainly didn't think of it, and I'm a big Walking Dead fan as well, but influence is still there. And honestly, I've dealt with this so many times of, like, my most recent one again, like I'm a huge fan of One Piece. I'm a huge fan of Pirates of the Caribbean. I want to read and watch things that are swashbuckling, that are romantic, that combine the supernatural with like adventure, but that are silly and funny and have like a sense of humor, basically. And so I'm very much influenced by those things, but I take what I'm influenced by and I mix it with the things that I want to see more of, because we could always use another Princess Bride. Not saying I can do that, but I want to emulate that as much as possible because I have a real passion for it. And I love to say on this show, honesty is your pathway to art. If you're honest, you can be an artist. Like, you can't really fake it. If you're trying to write something because you're like, well, I don't want to take my influences and, I don't want to wear my heart on my sleeve. I'm going to write this thing because this thing is like super popular right now. This is what people want to read. People will see right through it. They're not going to connect with a story that clearly is not the one that you want to tell. But it's not easy to always know which story you want to tell. It can take a little bit of work. It can take some soul searching. And I'll just rip pages out because I'm like, I don't want to tell this story. Forget it. But then maybe the next day I'll be like, this is the story that I wanted to tell all along. I just needed to be patient with myself and not beat myself up for, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so tempting to think of when you're playing in a sandbox that has had so many prolific authors like fantasy has, where there's so many just very canon tropes and characters and settings. It can feel like you're just writing fan fiction. And fan fiction is wonderful, honestly, and there's so many things that are literal actual fan fiction of something else, like 50 Shades being fan fiction of Twilight, that are their own, works in their own right. But I think a lot of us don't want to just be mimics, or we don't want to be trying on somebody else's shoes and running around in them, right? And we want to carve our own path as artists. And I think that fear is a healthy one, but if you have that fear, it's a pretty good sign that you're not actually doing it. Because the mimics who are writing ripoffs don't really care, and they wouldn't be having that fear or letting it guide them or searching for ways to bring their own originality to it. They would just be happy writing the ripoffs and go on their merry way. So if you're concerned about that, I think it's a wonderful sign that you're actually doing great work, and to keep doing what you're doing and in fact do more of it.
Yeah. And I would definitely add, keep reading outside of your genre.
Yeah.
Because I love reading. I've mentioned on the show before, I love reading like YA romance novels. They make me feel younger. And I think part of it is that like the prose, mm-hmm. I think we're so easily influenced by prose. I'll be reading, Wheel of Time or something, and all of a sudden I'm like, man, why is my manuscript suddenly so, formal and direct? I'm like, I need to kind of, maybe read something else to kind of mix my brain up so that my prose kind of goes back, resets to like my voice a little bit more naturally. Not to say that that's a bad thing necessarily, but yeah, I think that that's it's a good problem to have when you are aware of these influences, and you want to focus, of course, on being able to channel what influences you in a way that's a strength, not a weakness. Because when it comes time to sell your book, and like, let's say you're in that physical bookstore and somebody comes up to you, they see your book on the shelf and they're like, cool, this is your book. Should I buy it? And I'm like, well, do you like this book? Do you like this other book? My book is kind of like this meets this, or, if you like this book, I think you'll like this. And people will be like, yeah, you're right. I did like that book. So maybe I'll check yours out too. So yeah, don't shy away from your influences as much as possible. And yeah, I think being an inner critic is okay, but you have to love yourself too, for sure. We have some comments here from that original prompt. Maybe we can go through a couple of them and then we can call it. Karez Nar writes, concentrate on telling an interesting story, not an original one. And then someone responded, J. Robert Matheson, or at least a coherent one. And yeah, I mean, I think originality is not something you can like plan. So I agree with that aspect of it. But I also think interesting isn't always something you can plan either. So that's not usually where my mind goes. Like, I don't sit down and look at the page and be like, how do I make this interesting? I guess what I'll do is I'll just focus on what story do I want to tell. And when I edit, I'll be like, how could this scene be more compelling or interesting? That's a little bit more my take. But what about you, Kate?
Yeah, that gives me a lot of thoughts. And I think you're right. Some of those things can't be planned. What can be planned, though, that I think often authors miss is the difference between plot and premise. And so often, the market for fantasy and originality, freshness and uniqueness in fantasy really depends on the premise. And oftentimes, when I was first starting out, my first book was a fantasy that I've ever wrote. It was a modern Greek mythology retelling. And I completely missed the fact that I needed to have that originality in the premise, in the concept for the book, in the things that come onto the table in the first 25 to 30%, because that's what is going to be your back cover copy. That's what's going to be your query letter. That's what's going to reach readers and be the word of mouth selling points, really. And I was trying to pack all this originality into the characters, the settings, the twists and turns of the plot, the subtext, the backstory, specific events, and all of that is great. But my idea overall was not very original. And therefore, all of the originality you would never know unless you actually opened the book. And I really struggled to pull everything together in a way that worked well and made the pacing fast and hung together as a cohesive story to even make a coherent story, as your one commenter said, because I didn't have a single big idea that the book was about that got on the table in the first 30%. And what I did have that approached that was very similar to everybody else's. So I guess I would say, look at your premise and make sure that that's your biggest, best, most original idea, the very concept of the book. And don't just kind of by accident cram it all into the plot instead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, because I know you specifically, I brought this up, you specifically taught me so much about how your premise and your pitch paragraph, I mean, they're your secret weapon when it comes to finding representation. And yeah, it's like thinking of your book in the macro like that before you commit to all of this like time and effort. I mean, it saves you time, that's for sure. But it also just gets you in the right headspace when you're drafting and you feel like, I don't have every chapter completely, specified at this current moment, but I have enough to kind of work with in terms of like, I know what the destination is on the emotional dramatic level. Mm-hmm. And I know that my premise is agent ready. Now I just have to write the thing and then actually show it to agents if I want to be traditionally published, of course, or if I want to sell something, self-publish something, and I want the premise to be so juicy, have all those really great selling points and hooks that, people won't be able to resist. It makes me think of like, I mean, you can even have something like, Fourth Wing, right? I brought it up in the last show. I did say I did not finish that book, and that is my decision. But I'll say, like, what was the originality of that? I think what made that blast off was like, oh, you're taking, it's not that it was like a super original concept, people riding dragons. We just got that with Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, all that. But I think what got people excited about that book was like, yeah, it's kind of that, but it's also, this sort of YA, like it's doing all the like typical YA stuff as well, but it's putting it in that kind of motif, and it has like a couple of little extra quirks to it. That was enough for people to be like, oh yeah, okay, I want to read that book because we haven't seen that exactly in the marketplace yet. And so it took off like crazy, and now it has all these sequels or whatever at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Or what if a dragon got a job at a local failing pizza cafe as their pizza oven, and he totally revived the family business? That would be dragons we've not seen before, right?
Mm-hmm. There you go.
But I think you're totally right about the premise being your secret weapon there. And I guess I would say, if I could sum up originality and marketability in fantasy, I would say it's more important than ever that you take that premise And instead of going bigger and more, go deeper and simpler and wilder and weirder and more heart-wrenching or more heartfelt, sweeter, more unexpected. And if what you're doing there is on a scale of 1 to 10, you think it's a 10, pretend it's a 5 and see how you could take it on the weirdness and wildness scale from a 5 to a 10, on the heart-wrenching scale from a 5 to a 10.
I'm glad you coupled that though with like still keeping it simple, because I think you can easily fall into the trap of overthinking it and adding too many things. And then it just feels a little messy. It feels a little bit like, I think I call it like first book syndrome, where it's just you want it to have everything. But if it has everything, it doesn't have anything at a certain point. So let's look at like one more comment here. This is from Not a Tem, and they write, "Hi, professional writer for the past 10 plus years here. You're fine, your book is fine, the way you're feeling is completely normal, but if you want to write, you've got to learn to shrug it off. When you're submitting a book to a traditional publisher, one of the first things they ask you for are comp titles, books that are enough like yours that they share a target audience. Ever heard someone describe Aragon as Star Wars with dragons? Or heard someone describe their book as, it's like Narnia meets the Blair Witch Project? That's a comp title. Editors and agents love books with a juicy set of comps, because when people love a thing, they often want to see more of that thing. People love dramatic battles between two people who are at the top of their game, total opposites, yet two halves of one whole. They love it so much that it's part of the effing Epic of Gilgamesh. People have been telling this story as long as they've been people. Put bluntly, this is not a story problem, this is a confidence problem. You don't feel like you deserve to be here, and your brain is trying to come up with some reason why that is. And the cure for it, I'm sorry to say, is finishing what you start." And that Normal did respond to that. Thanks, it really means a lot. And yeah, that's such helpful advice, and definitely agree with what they're saying here, because there's no new idea, but that's okay, because what's new about it is that you're writing a book about this idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that commenter is right on the money. That's excellent advice. And I think it really just comes down to trusting yourself and bringing yourself to it. What do you want to bring to this trope? What do rivals and experts mean to you? And how can you make that come alive in your way? And just because we've been writing about this since people were people, as commenter said, doesn't mean we're done with it, because you're unique. And if you really listen to yourself and bring yourself to it, you're going to do it in a way nobody else has. Absolutely. And that's why I feel like, the older I get, I just feel like I'm learning new things about myself and being able to put that in my work too. And it's definitely one of the few things about getting older that I'm in peace with, I suppose. But all right, Kate Brauning, I couldn't thank you enough for coming on, sharing your wisdom. And I'm sure there are probably a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 who are like, wow, Kate, I wish that, I wish I could hear you talk about this stuff all the time. John's old news. But I guess, Kate, there's just no possible way that they could, hear from you more. And, sorry, it looks like you're waving me down that I'm forgetting about something. Yeah. So I run a professional development program for writers, which is just a very fancy pants way of saying we do intensive coaching. In my experience as an acquiring editor, as a talent scout for a major media company, as an author myself, there are a lot of things that I just really wish I had known earlier, and things that I've seen writers struggle with that are just not available from agents and editors normally. There's MFA programs, there's writing certificates, but they don't cover a lot of the things that you learn when you're on the other side of the desk. And being an editor has made me so much a better writer, and vice versa, that I started to really want to share that with other writers so that they didn't end up in some of the same spots I did. And so what I created is the Breakthrough Writers Bootcamp. And thanks for saying such nice things about it, John. Basically, I do live webinars where we talk like this, sometimes more casually, where we'll workshop your stuff, and sometimes more formally, where I'll dig into a specific topic and go through it, point by point. But I do one-on-one consulting and working on your book, and live workshops and webinars teaching everything from the basics of publishing contracts, so you know what an option clause is, and net versus gross royalties, and know how to advocate for yourself, and see green versus red flags in agents and publishing houses and publishing deals, all the way to macro and micro voice and emotional engagement and how to really tackle those things from a process that brings the art and the science of writing together.
You know, I did the boot camp for, gosh, I think it was like 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And I loved every second of it. I mean, it was just, I feel like working with you and getting to know the other writers, you know, having that community of writers as well. I don't think I would be able to, you know, I wouldn't be able to do a podcast like this because, yeah, I just think that, you know, those webinars and the resources that you pointed to and the different people that you would bring on from around, you know, you would have like agents come on and do webinars as well as editors and just all of these amazing, wonderful, smart people. It really was like such an amazing experience. And, you know, I've told you before that, like, you know, one of these days I got to get back into it and, work, whatever I'm going to develop next, try to get your help. Cause I know that if I get your help on it, it's going to be the best version of it that I think I can make it. So I couldn't recommend it more, especially cause, there are all kinds of awesome resources online, writing resources, but there's really no substitute for actually having the opportunity to talk to an expert and articulate, like, here's where I'm at, and here are the very specific problems I'm having, but in real time, kind of just, talk about your story with someone and have them, have that feedback loop, because it's just so helpful in terms of really helping you like assess kind of your current skill level and also what you actually want out of a story long term. So looking at this not just as your craft, which is also super important, but looking at it as your career and something that you want to develop into a passion that's going to last you for a long time. So yeah, I hope some folks who listen to this take that to heart and maybe reach out to you. All they have to do is go to breakthroughwriters.com or just find the link, of course, in the show notes. But yeah, we'll leave it there for now. So Kate, thanks so much again. And if I invite you on, I hope that you say yes, but you can always give me the soft, John, I'm just so busy, but maybe.
Oh, John, I would never. Thank you so much for having me. You, honestly, I felt like I learned from you in the program while you were there. And you're such an inventive and original and unique writer. You're so motivated and disciplined and willing to do the work. And, like I've said so many times in this episode, you really bring yourself to the writing. And I think anybody who listens to this podcast is just lucky to have found you.
Thanks, Kate. I really appreciate that. I needed to hear that today. No, but I really appreciate that. And but anxious to have you on as many times as we certainly can. So, all right, that'll do it for today's Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. We will be back soon, of course. And so a special shout out. Thanks again to Natalia Emmons for finding today's prompt. Also, thanks to Bridget Surdock, our other producer, for all the wonderful work that they do on putting this podcast together and making it a reality. And yes, thanks as always. So be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.
High Five Casino. High Five Casino is a social casino with real prizes and big Vegas hits at highfivecasino.com. The hottest games right from Vegas, and all winnings go straight to your bank account. Hundreds of exclusive games, free daily rewards, and come back to get free coins every 4 hours. Only at highfivecasino.com.
High Five Casino is a social casino. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Play responsibly. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details at high5casino.com. High Five Casino.